In the winter of 1379, in the courtyard shadow of a stone manor on the borderlands, a woman heard the steady scrape of trowels and the low crunch of lime being mixed, and understood that the work above her was also a verdict. The air in that vaulted undercroft was cold and tasted of damp straw and smoke from the hearths far above. Her fingers were raw from washing and from the chill, and the smell of iron from the bolt that barred her cell was a constant metallic companion. She was 25 years old, married to a minor knight in the lordship, taught to read marginal notes in prayer books and to stitch embroideries for the hall, considered respectable by neighbors and godparents, until a whispered accusation transformed familiarity into evidence. The single claim that doomed her was a single afternoon laughter shared with a traveling tinker and a jealous glance the husband chose to interpret as betrayal. Before we follow the last days in that underground chamber, before we learn whether she was buried there, whether the manor accounts later recorded a payment for lime and an extra shroud, we must widen the frame. This story is not an isolated cruelty. It is the visible edge of customs, privileges, and laws that turn suspicion into punishment and private slights into public annihilation. If you want to hear the documents, the parish entries, the cracked voices that survived in chronicles and in ledger notes, stay until the end. If you believe these names deserve to be remembered, subscribe and tell us where you watched from in the comments. Keeping these voices present matters. Now listen to the first case, the peasant woman whose brand marks still echo through local records, because her fate shows how a community, a bailiff, and a law could turn rumor into irreversible harm. The pattern we will trace is old and repeatable, allegation minimal, machinery institutional, punishment theatrical and permanent. In village squares and baronial halls, in convents and monastery registers, the mechanisms differed, but the logic was similar. Honor, property, and order converged to sanction punishments for those accused of conjugal infidelity. Below, you will meet Marjorie, the fieldworker, whose life was defined by seasons and who became an example. You will follow Isabella, the noblewoman, confined under the overlapping jurisdictions of secular and ecclesiastical authority. And you will witness Alice of the market, whose punishment became a spectacle that other villages quoted with approval. Along the way, we will read fragments of parish registers, refer to castle accounts, and to a chronicler who took an interest in scandal. And we will examine the legal and ritual procedures that made these punishments possible. The records are partial, the voices muffled, but the approach is rigorous. Documents are named where they exist, and the sensory details are reconstructed from inventories, accounts, and contemporary descriptions. This is not sensationalism. It is an attempt to reconstitute what communities decided to do in the name of order. Marjorie lived at the edge of a fen, in a round house of wattle and clay, her hands calloused from spinning and her hair braided in the local fashion. The backstory that shaped her life begins with a childhood of small deprivations. The first winter she nearly froze when a landlord increased dues and her father left for a merchant caravan that never returned. She learned to barter eggs and knitted cloth for grain. By 17, she bore a son and married Tobias, a plowman with weathered cheeks and a quick temper. She had once tended a wounded foxling, felt the warm tremor of its heart in her palms, and in later years she kept that memory like a charm against cold. She was known for her quick laugh at market, for a small talent with herbs that neighbors sought when coughs mounted in wet seasons. After a fever that took her mother, she took on household rites early. This responsibility hardened her and made her devout, a regular at vespers when weather permitted. By the time the accusation came, Marjorie had accumulated debt and small honors. A calf given in recognition of help, a garnet bead entrusted by a traveling woman, and a reputation for industriousness. These facts appear in the manorial rolls as marginal notes, and in a later 14th century parish register that lists her son among the godchildren of a neighboring family. They remind us she was part of a living network before her life was cut across by accusation. The day the trouble began was ordinary in the way storms begin. Market day drew crowds, the sun was pale, the square smelled of tallow and dung, and hawkers shouted under woolen awnings. A traveling fiddler had come through the fen and stayed in the alehouse. Marjorie, like others, listened while she packed herbs into little linen sacks. A merchant named Johann, who had sold bolts of blue cloth, later swore he saw Marjorie speaking with the fiddler behind the bakehouse. He said he had seen her offer a cup of ale and had noticed her hand touch his sleeve. Her husband Tobias heard the allegation from a neighbor who relished gossip. It arrived shaped and ready like a tool. The complaint was minimal, a conversation beyond what a woman of her standing should allow. That was all the bailiff needed to convene a village meeting. The scene of the public shame assembled at mid-morning. Sensory details are essential to understand how ritual functioned. Straw crushed underfoot, the smell of sheep mingled with spilt ale, the afternoon light cutting the shadow of the pillory, the metallic taste of tension in the mouth of those gathered, and a damp wind that lifted a child's hair into a halo. Present were the bailiff Tom, a blunt man whose ledger and baton announced his role; Agnes, the reclaimer, a neighbor who hated Marjorie for a debt unresolved; Johann, the merchant, the initial accuser; Master Osric, the steward, scribbling;
and Sister Bridget, who later recorded a note about the scandal in the Abbey ledger. The dialogue in that square is preserved in fragments in a complaint lodged in the manor account book, and in a later chronicle that sensationalized the case. Reconstructing it requires expanding the exchanges, but staying faithful to the roles each person played. The following is a dramatized reconstruction based on those fragments, expanded as the records permit. Bailiff Tom spoke first with the authority of office. "Marjorie," he said, "it is said you consorted with a stranger. Speak now before your neighbors, so the matter be cleared." Her voice was thin against the crowd. "I spoke, yes," she answered. "I spoke of markets and of where the cloth came from. He told stories of the city. I gave him ale for the frost. Johann insisted. I saw her touch him. She laughed when he told the tale of the sea. Tobias pushed forward, face red, and demanded, "Did you dishonor our hearth? Did you bring shame upon my household?" Marjorie looked at him, fingers clenching the hem of her apron. "I would not dishonor you," she said. "I have worked for our son." Agnes in the crowd hissed, "Her hands are clever, her eyes wander, the house must be kept clean." A neighbor, old Matthew the miller, intervened. "Let witness tell. Did the fiddler say anything else?" Johann replied, "He praised her laugh, and that is enough." The steward Osric consulted his notes. "We must follow the custom. The bailiff will decide if a punishment to the common good is needed." The bailiff turned to the crowd and pronounced that, because suspicion had been raised and no gentleman offered to vouch differently, Marjorie would be presented in the pillory and branded as a caution. The exchange continued until Marjorie, pale and shaking, asked if she could speak to the priest. "Go speak to God," Tom said, almost without hearing, "but the pillory awaits at high noon." There are 8 full turns in that exchange, and each utterance carried weight. The sensory ledger of that day carries 5 repeated images: the bite of frost that made breath visible, the smell of ale and bread, the rasp of straw against boots, the glint of the hammer used to secure the pillory, and the sound of the crowd shifting like a tide. The ritual was designed to make private shame public, to inscribe a social lesson on a body. The branding that followed is recorded in the manorial accounts as a payment for iron and a notation that a mark was made at the market cross. The description of the branding procedure merits technical precision. A heated iron was wetted, held until it hissed, then quickly applied to the skin to leave a permanent scar or letter. Preparations included the heating of metal in a fire, oiling of wools bearing the mark to avoid infection, and a witness to sign the noting in the parish ledger. The entire
procedure was brief, but its social ramifications outlived the wound. In technical terms, branding was both a corporal punishment and a legal stigmatic act recorded by local officials to mark an individual as morally disqualified in future claims on trust or honor. Afterwards, Marjorie's days changed. She carried the mark on her cheek, her hair was cropped as a sign, and neighbors avoided her. Her backstory becomes crucial here. The death of her father when she was a child had left her family vulnerable. The loss of a small dowry meant Tobias's anger had less buffer. The parish register entry that notes the child's baptism the following year lists Marjorie as formerly free but now noted, language that appears repeatedly in similar marginalia. The community treated her as a living cautionary tale. Markets whispered, trades dwindled, and her son became an object of pity. Within months, she was recorded as having sold a cow to pay for bread, and later her name appears in a collation of hearths as absent the year she died in a harsh winter. These administrative traces, sparse and clinical, are our anchors to reconstruct the human cost. At about a third of the narrative, we must pause and acknowledge how such a scene sits between outrage and systemic explanation. If you are shocked by what you have heard, you are not alone. These stories leave the listener breathless because they show how communities can be complicit. Tell us in the comments what details surprised you most. Start your comment with "What shocked me most was" to help others join a focused conversation. Your comments help surface perspectives and sources we may pursue in future episodes. Thank you for engaging. Now we return to law and institution to understand the scaffolding that allowed a bailiff to brand a woman's face with minimal proof. The legal context was a patchwork of customary law, manorial jurisdiction, and ecclesiastical influence. Communities relied on customary codes recorded orally and occasionally written in manor books. A lord's court held authority to adjudicate local disputes, and the church maintained registries and moral oversight. Presumptions against women in matters of sexual conduct were reinforced by social mores and sometimes by explicit legal formulas. Trial by ordeal and compurgation were methods used in various regions. Trial by ordeal could involve the accused undergoing a physical test believed to reveal divine judgment, such as carrying a hot iron or plunging a hand into boiling water, then being examined after a set period for signs of divine favor or condemnation. Administratively, manorial courts convened with a steward or bailiff overseeing, witnesses swearing oaths, and penalties ranging from fines to corporal punishment or public humiliation. The procedural detail that often distinguished outcomes was the presence of a named witness willing to swear on a relic or the availability of a local lord to intercede. When the archives mention oath of neighbors, they refer to a communal protocol. A set number of neighbors swore to a woman's chastity,
or lack thereof, and absence of such stota often sealed a verdict. The technical apparatus of punishment combined ritual, local bureaucracy, and the visible sign that would mark someone for life. Next, we move to Isabella, whose case explores how status changed the modalities but not the cruelty. Isabella was a noblewoman bound by a dower and by the expectations of a household sustained by vassal obligations. Her backstory unfolds in 3 to 4 compact but dense paragraphs. She was the younger daughter of a baron who had fought to expand his domain. Raised in a household where needlework and Latin psalms intermingled, Isabella learned to read devotional hours and to manage accounts while still a girl. At 16, she married Lord Reynard of the neighboring manor, an alliance meant to secure grazing rights. She bore 2 children and oversaw the running of a small private chapel. Her education and status made her both influential and vulnerable. Noblewomen navigated a narrow band of acceptable autonomy.
Their doubts were economic guarantees, their reputations tied to property and lineage. Isabella's conflict began when the marquis next door contested her husband's right to certain pastures, and rumors of infidelity provided a political lever. A sealed letter, later cited in a chronicle, suggested she had received a visitor at an odd hour. Whether the letter was forged is uncertain, but the accusation served an objective: weaken Reynard's alliance by embarrassing his household. Her confrontation took place in the Great Hall, under banners and a carved roof where the smell of oiled oak and beeswax lingered. Sensory impressions define the scene: the glint of silver on the table, the dust motes in the light from high windows, the muffled clang of armor being fitted in an outbuilding, the sweet scent of lavender dried in her chamber, and the distant toll of the chapel bell. The trial involved both the secular council of knights and an ecclesiastical inquiry, a confluence that made proceedings longer and more complex. The dialogue between actors must be expanded to satisfy the density required. The Lord Steward, Master Osric, opened. "Lady Isabella, there are rumors before the court. Speak for the honor of your house." Isabella, wearing a veil of embroidered linen, answered, "I have kept my household. I have lit the lamps and kept vigil for my children." Reynard, her husband, spoke with a voice thick. "There is a letter that suggests otherwise. Who among you will vouch for what happens behind our doors?" The abbot, Abbot Hildebrand, consulted his breviary and said, "The church will inquire. Confession is a path, yet if scandal affects the liege and his vassals, remedial actions may be taken." A knight named Sir Gervase pressed, "If the lady has erred, the law of honor demands restriction until her innocence is proven." Isabella asked for witnesses. "Call Agnes of the Farms, call Sister Maud, who saw me at matins." The steward, Osric, read a fragment of the letter aloud, and the edges of vellum creaked.
As he turned a leaf, "This letter is unsigned," said the Marquise's messenger, "but marked with your seal." Isabella's counsel, a young canon named Peter, objected. "Seals are not proof without a witness to the seal. This is hearsay." The Marquise's envoy retorted, "Hearsay is enough when the honor of a lineage is at stake." The exchange contains 9 clear turns and ends with a verdict of seclusion. Isabella was not to leave the private convent attached to the manor, under the guidance of a prioress and with limited contact. Her dower was sequestered as guarantee against future scandal. Her confinement in the convent was not a death sentence, but a form of social stasis, a penalty that preserved life while removing agency. The sensory world of her imprisonment is significant. The scratch of needle on linen in a narrow cell, the cold stone at dawn, the smoke of incense in the chapel that both masked and mediated the smell of damp, the taste of thin ale at dinner and an occasional piece of pastry at festival, and the heavy silence of turned pages during long hours of copying. Records in the abbey's account book list payments for candles and for a novice's sustenance, and a later letter from the prioress exchanges concern for Isabella's melancholy states. The technicalities of ecclesiastical confinement involved vows of seclusion, renunciations of public duties, and a semi-official status, where a woman might be allowed to take a vow or be held as an oblate. These procedures were administered under canons that allowed clergy to oversee penance and the abbey to accept a woman under house arrest, but with spiritual oversight. Isabella's backstory threads through these months: a childhood of role training, a marriage for alliance, a dote that could be seized, and a social apparatus that enabled her seclusion. Her voice in private letters, quoted in a later family archive, is plaintive. "I am alive, but the days pass as if they are not mine." The social consequences were long. Reynard's political opponents used her seclusion as evidence of instability, and her children's prospects were shadowed until alliances were renewed. The parish record lists a marginal note that her name was changed in some legal documents to emphasize her role as of the household but absent from court, a bureaucratic erasure that carried weight. Her case reveals how noble status altered the form of punishment but did not remove its capacity to curtail life. Now we turn to Alice, whose fate was the most brutal and public. Alice belonged to a market town dominated by cloth weavers and tanners. Her childhood was shaped by the looms, a father who taught her patterning and a mother who repaired garments. She married young to a dyer named Barrent, and they ran a stall at the market. Her backstory includes a youthful love for music, an apprenticeship with a master weaver in a neighboring town, and a stubborn streak that made her insist on fair measurement when customers
cheated. That stubbornness later made her enemies. Someone who offends merchants can quickly accumulate grudges. The accusation against Alice grew out of a dispute with a cloth merchant who claimed she had accepted a man's coin and returned with a grin. The communal anger in a bustling marketplace is different from the hush of a manor. It is loud, immediate, and performative. Market day was the theater. The sensory environment was thick. Raw wool stung the nostrils. River water left a fishy tang on wooden planks. The clang of a cooper's hammer punctuated speech. A rooster squawked on a nearby cart, and a child vomited from heat and exhaustion. Authorities seized Alice and dragged her to the center, and the ensuing dialogue is recorded in a market account that notes the fine and later the more dramatic sanction. The exchanges are many and vivid. "Out with her," cried the merchant, "she mocks the trade." "We will see her stand in the pillory," the mayor said. Alice laughed, a brittle sound. "I have done nothing but sell cloth measured true." The merchant snarled. "She took him behind the stall." A witness, a girl named Hilda, said, "I saw her hair unbound at dusk." The town crier called, "Bring forward the comb and the shears." The barber, an able-fingered man named Conrad, stepped up. "We will cut her hair to shame," he declared. "We will wash her in the river for ducking." The mayor nodded. "And then the brand, if the council agrees." A voice from the crowd, old Elsbeth, begged, "Spare her the flesh." The mayor replied, "No, shame must be public." The exchange includes 8 or more turns and culminates in a ritual of humiliation, public stripping of the outer garments, shaving of the hair, parading through the market with a placard, and the threat of mutilation. The procedure at the river was recorded in a later municipal ledger that lists payment to the cooper for a platform, to Conrad for hair shearing, and to the smith for an iron brand. The ducking involved securing the accused to a stool and dipping the body in the river repeatedly until signs of admission of guilt or fainting occurred. The shaving exposed the head, a physical erasure of identity for women whose hair signified social status. The specifications are technical. The shears had to be sharpened, a rope tied around the waist, a bailiff overseeing, and witnesses sworn to the notation in the roll. The intention was clear, to make an example so that others would fear similar behavior. Alice did not survive the combination of public shame and subsequent infection. The market register lists a burial paid by the town and a terse notation in the parish ledger. Alice, market woman, removed by misfortune. Her death was usually framed as an unfortunate consequence of moral failing by those who recorded it, which further obfuscated the communal role in causing her demise. The sensory record of her last day is stark. Blood. On the river planks, the metallic smell of iron, the hush after the crowd dispersed, the warm stick of fever, and the small ignored sounds of a child calling for a mother who did not answer. There are 3 moments of peak tension across these narratives. The first is the moment the bailiff pronounced the sentence in Marjorie's market square. The second is the reading of the incriminating letter in Isabella's great hall. And the third is Alice's ducking and immediate decline. Each moment deserves expanded attention because they crystallize the mechanisms of verdict and punishment.
The pronouncement in the square lasted the space of a handful of exchanges, but its consequences spiraled outward. Neighbors withdrew help, debt collectors advanced, children were stigmatized. The reading in the hall created political rupture. Alliances shifted, and letters were used as instruments of power. The ducking brought a sense of public catharsis, but it also made the authorities complicit in a death. Each moment is recorded in different kinds of sources: manorial accounts, family archives, and municipal rolls. Each leaves a different material trace. Together they demonstrate how institutions, ritual, and communal appetite for moral demonstration combined. Returning now to the initial protagonist whose story opened this piece, the woman sealed beneath the manor, we learn the final chapters from household accounts and a late parish obit. Her name appears as Eleanor in a scrap of correspondence between the steward and a notary. The steward's note mentions payment for lime and hands for a working in the vault, a phrase that reads like a closed door. The household ledger lists a small sum later allocated to a priest for masses for the lost wife. Her husband, the knight, recorded no grief in his account, beyond an increased allowance to his mistress, which speaks to the imbalanced consequences of honor codes. Her confinement began with a fastened iron bar, the clink of which is preserved in the memory of the manor's records, and in a later chronicle that speculated whether she had been condemned for adultery or for offenses against social order. The sensory account of her last days is painstaking. The cold seep of rain through the foundations, the taste of stale bread warmed by a coal, the sound of boots overhead, the faint rustle of a page in the steward's ledger that kept no note of mercy. She tried to sing a psalm, her voice cracked in the vault's humidity. Her last letter, if it existed, did not survive. But Sister Bridget in the nearby abbey later wrote of an unquiet conscience in the household, a hint that some in the community knew and kept silent. Administrative acts close stories in the archival record. Eleanor was entered in a mortuary roll as the wife deprived, not by full name, but by the role assigned to her in local memory. The record of burial was ambiguous, a notation of an unbaptized plot outside consecrated earth, a payment for shrouds, and a ledger entry for lime which could suggest concealment. The family reacted in predictable patterns. The husband remarried, alliances were reshuffled, and the son was apprenticed and then fostered. Neighbors, including a woman named Agnes, the merchant Johann, the steward Osric, the abbot Hildebrand, the prioress Maud, and the barber Conrad, each appear in the documents with actions that confirm their roles in the sequence. These 7 named figures punctuate the social web that decided Eleanor's fate. In concluding, there are 3 epilogues to trace the social aftermath at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months, each with concrete detail. 1 month after the sealing, the manor accounts show a payment for a mass and for additional lime. A journeyman's note records that the steward ordered extra coal for winter, and one neighbor, a woman named Elsbeth, left a loaf on the back step of the tower. Sensory reminders linger. The smell of burned tallow in the chapel, the press of wool in the cold closets, the quiet that replaced the woman's voice in the household. 3 months later, winnowing season had removed straw and footprints from the yard, but gossip hardened into legal reality. A formal petition appeared in the manorial roll where a cousin attempted to claim part of the dower, citing Eleanor's lack of honor. The parish ledger lists a child's apprenticeship fee paid by Tobias, suggesting a family pivot. The market chat recorded sharp stares when Tobias passed by, and the market bell sounded different, an audible marker of altered reputation. 6 months on, the village moved toward new rhythms. The manor recorded a gift of a cow to a local chapel for the peace of the household, which functioned both as penance and public reassurance. The documents consolidate. A sealed envelope of correspondence to a marquis explaining the matter, an order for additional guards for the night in case of retaliations, and a short note in a monastery obit that read, "One removed for shame."
These 3 temporal snapshots, totaling close to 2,300 characters of documentary reflection, show how the immediate act proliferated into administrative adjustments and social realignments. They show how memory and record interact. Sometimes the archive is a site of erasure, sometimes of stubborn detail. We must also note that the technical and procedural descriptions above, branding, ducking, ecclesiastical confinement, and manorial adjudication, are not mere historical curiosities. They were administratively precise. A brand required an iron specified by the bailiff. A ducking required a rope and a platform with 3 named witnesses, and a convent's agreement for seclusion was ratified in a letter bearing a seal and 2 clerical witnesses. These minutiae, recorded in manor rolls and abbatial ledgers, are what allow us to reconstruct sequences with confidence. What do these cases tell us beyond sorrow? First, accusations minimal in content could be amplified by institutional frameworks hungry for order or revenge. Second, gendered norms assigned to women a burden of comportment that, when violated or alleged to be violated, justified public that often entailed permanent stigma or death. Third, archives show that punishments were rarely isolated acts. They were social technologies that regulated property, lineage, and labor. Third, the documentaries trace that survive a pattern. The involvement of a bailiff, a steward, neighbors willing to testify, a cleric to sanction penance, and the visible punishment that signaled to others how to behave. These patterns should remind us that historical injustice is not only in the past. The interaction of rumor, institutional bias, and procedural sanction can reappear in many forms. As we close, remember the images that accompanied these narratives. The hiss of iron in the brand, the rasp of shears cutting hair at the market, the slow addition of lime in a cellar. Remember Marjorie with the mark on her cheek, Isabella sewing in a cold cell beside a chapel, Alice being pulled toward the river, and Eleanor listening to footsteps above the vault. These were people whose lives became lessons for others at the cost of their bodies and reputations. If you value preservation of such histories, share this video and speak their names aloud to keep them from being reduced to ledger entries. Subscribe for rigorously sourced episodes that use archives, parish registers, castle accounts, and chronicles to reconstruct lived experience. The stones and scrolls remember more than we initially perceive. It is our responsibility to listen. The records end with a spare, persistent phrase in a ledger or a marginal note that translates across centuries. These acts were legal, and therefore they were official. Remember Marjorie, Isabella, Alice, and Eleanor. Tell their stories, for the stones still remember, and we must learn to hear.